start by thanking Your Honor for a wonderful hospitality and for your, if I may say so, very stimulating conversation at dinner. It was quite wonderful. Thank my colleague, Anne McClellan, who was responsible for my being here. She has a way of persuading people, it's been wonderful working with her over many years. I remember she may not remember this exact moment, but I do. I was with Arlene, my wife, on our 25th wedding anniversary. We were in Hawaii, and we had just come from being. I was on a mission in Sri Lanka, and I visited Australia, and then we said, well, let's stop for a few days in Hawaii. So when I got there, of course, Anne phoned, not to wish me a happy anniversary or anything, but to ask me to do a job on the Air India bombing situation, which was actually an extraordinary opportunity and experience for me. But it also was the moment in which I began to think that maybe I should think about getting back into political life, which was another wrong turn, but a very interesting one. I mean, always follow the directions that life takes you. And it's a great pleasure to see a couple of people here who I want to just call out and say how wonderful it is to see them. My good friend Michael Pearson and Kelly Buck was here. It's wonderful to see Michael. I'm going to be talking a bit about his grandfather, and I know Michael's working on a book about his grandfather, and I think it's going to be a wonderful opportunity for all of you to continue to keep in touch with the legacy that is the legacy of Lester B. Pearson. So it's wonderful to have the members of the Pearson family with us today. It's just terrific. And I'm also very conscious of the fact that the former member of Parliament from this part of the world, David Anderson, is with us tonight. And David, it's great to see you here, former Minister of the Environment, champion of So when Anne phoned me, I don't think she knew why immediately I would just say yes. Even though I won't go into my schedule the last 2 or 3 days, but you would say it's kind of crazy for you to be here, but it's not at all crazy for me to be here. It's a wonderful opportunity for me to pay tribute to two things. One is to pay tribute to international education, of which I am the beneficiary myself personally in my own life. I'll talk a little bit about that. It's also an opportunity for me to talk a little bit about Mr. Pearson and what his diplomatic legacy still means to me. That means to all of us who really think and care about what his life meant and continues to mean to the life of the world. And also to talk about a couple of what I call lessons learned. This will all take just a few minutes. It's not going to be it's not going to be a painful exercise. It'll be a lot shorter than the debate that none of us watched earlier on. So first of all, just a little bit about my own education. My dad was a diplomat, and I had the opportunity to travel a lot as a boy. We lived in London, we lived in Washington, and then when I was 14, we moved to Geneva, Switzerland. And for 4 years, I was a student at the International School of Geneva, known as Ecoland. And actually, as luck would have it, I was the guest speaker at the 100th anniversary of Ecoland in June. And it was like this gathering. It was a chance to celebrate what an extraordinary experience it is to be an international student. The interesting thing about Canada that I think we need to think more and reflect more about and embrace more about is that most of us are now having an international education in Canada. We need to fully appreciate the fact that, yes, we are in the world. Canada is inextricably linked to what is going on all around the world. But we also need to know that because of all the things that have happened in terms of the migration patterns of the world over the last 50 years, and this is in good measure in part because of one policy that Mr. Pearson introduced in the mid-1960s, we have become a truly international country. The world is in us. And so it is, I think, so important for us in celebrating what this means to understand and appreciate the vision that went into the creation of this school, the vision that went into, I know some of you students are going to say, are you crazy? The vision that went into the International Baccalaureate, which is an incredible, it came from the idea of a few teachers in international schools in the 1960s, and it has now become an incredibly powerful educational assessment and program and curriculum that links students from all around the world. People suddenly being thrown together and having to come to grips with the fact that the things that we have in common, the things that we share, are much, much, much greater than the things that divide us. And I can remember when I was at school, we would have every year a big Students United Nations program. And we would all pick countries and we'd all go off. And it was the major kind of school, common school activity apart from music and sports. But it was so fascinating to say, okay, you have to take, and they would sometimes say, we don't want you to take your own country. Take some other country. And then they would say to us more and more, well, don't just take a Western European country. Take a country in Africa or Asia, Latin America, and learn about it, and then learn how it works and learn how it goes, and then get into the discussions. And I must confess, it was an incredible experience that, as I was doing it and as I was experiencing it, I didn't think this was unusual. And I realized when I came back to Canada that it had left something inside me which has never left me. So you can imagine how when Mr. Trudeau said, would you like to go to New York as our ambassador? I said, well, I mean, what took you so long? Was the first thing. I didn't actually say that. I thought it. But it was to say, well, thank you, sir. I would be honored to do it. And I must confess that in the work that I do now, it is just an extrapolation and a coming together of all of the things that I have had the opportunity to participate in and work on. But I want to talk really about how this connects with Mr. Pearson. Lester Pearson was born as son of a minister, went the early part of the 20th century, went to public school, into high school, and came to university, and then the First World War broke out. And he joined up. And we know from his biographies and from more reflections that have been made on his life that this was a very tough experience for him. It was not easy. And being in a situation where he saw the pain and suffering of war and where he realized that he might not make it, left a deep scar. And when he came back to go back to university and to do his graduate studies, to go off to Oxford, it was clear that he was part of a generation that had been deeply and permanently affected by the nature of that conflict, not only at a personal level, in terms of whatever the trauma means, but also in understanding that it was not possible to go back and say, well, I just want to go back to be a teacher and then just carry on as if nothing's happening out there. And it's fair to say that that's a parallel to the situation that faced Canada as a whole. Because as a country, we were still, in our foreign policy, really an extension of the empire. We were not person who chaired, Your Honor, you'll appreciate this true story, the person who chaired the first cabinet meeting about whether or not war should be declared was the Governor General of Canada, who was from the other side. And the war had such an impact on the Prime Minister of the day, Mr. Borden, that he insisted to his cabinet that he was going to be attending the Paris peace discussions, that he was going to be there on behalf of Canada, and he was, by the way, going to be away for a long time, like a year. Now you can imagine a Prime Minister saying that today, I'm going to be away at this conference for you. His cabinet was not happy, but he said, I know you're not going to be happy, but we have to make sure this war doesn't happen again, and we have to be part of building it up, and we're not going to be taking orders from any other country when it comes to figuring out where we go. And that was very much the Department of Foreign Affairs that Lester Pearson eventually joined after being a public servant in other ways in Ottawa. And lo and behold, he ends up going to London at the time of the Blitz, when once again the world is thrown into this conflict, where once again a generation is destroyed, where once again the same vulnerability and the same reality that this can affect us so deeply personally and in such a dramatic way. And after that happened, Mr. Pearson immediately, through that experience and everything else he'd done, decided that he wanted to be very much at the center of these activities. So the UN Charter that I have and I carry around in my pocket, because when my father died, I found 3 copies of the old UN Charter that were on his desk, and I have one. It's kind of beaten up. But Mr. Pearson was present at the creation of this charter. He was an integral part of the delegation in San Francisco. And he was an integral part of all of the thinking about what was the world we were entering and what did it mean for Canada. But what did it mean for the world? When I met Mr. Pearson, well, I met him first when I was a small boy, I'll tell you that story in a minute. When I met him when I was an older university student, at that time he was working on the World Bank report on global development. And I only had a chance at one breakfast meeting, and it was my father and I and Mr. Pearson were sitting around, and I was not a shy kid, unfortunately, or fortunately for me, and I asked him very quick, I said, what would you say would be the most important experience that you've had? You know, Prime Minister, Minister of Foreign Affairs, and all that. And he said, oh, that's easy. He looked directly at my father, and he said, you know what it is, Saul? My father laughed and said, yes, I know what it is. And he said, it's the work I did at the UN. And I think that what Mr. Pearson picked up in that first conference in San Francisco, and then as he eventually became, shortly thereafter, a few years thereafter, became Foreign Minister. As Foreign Minister, he spent a lot of time in New York. He was there on a regular basis. He was communicating and dealing directly. He was head of delegation. He was there all the time. And he said the one thing that I really, really felt was that all of my personal skills, all of my commitments, what I really believed in as a member of 2 generations that went to war, was that this is where we had to come to grips with this situation. And I said, well, what about being Prime Minister? He said, oh, that was okay. I enjoyed that. But this is really where my heart was. And I think that that's an important lesson for all of us as Canadians to know, that Lester Pearson's contributions, when you think about it, were quite extraordinary. First of all, president of the creation of the UN, one of the founders of the organization. After that, one of the drivers of how an early UN would deal with the conflicts in the world. What was the first conflict we had to deal with? Israel-Palestine. 1945, on our table, had to be dealt with. And that's what built up the credibility that allowed him to be the person who led the way in coming to grips with how we could end the Suez conflict and prevent the Suez conflict from becoming even worse and leading to even more loss of life. When the first implementation of a truly neutral UN peacekeeping force was given extra additional support at the United Nations, much bigger than any other forces that have been created before. But it doesn't stop there. Mr. Pearson was also a founder of NATO. He was also a leader of Canada at a time when what we thought was a big happy family at the United Nations was actually a world that was becoming even more divided and divisive than we'd seen before. They called it a Cold War, but it was a genuine, deep division in the world. And he felt that it was critically important for Canada to be secure and to be part of maintaining our own security and the security of others. And that in order for us to be able to do that, we had to join with others in creating not just the United Nations, but also the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and all the other range of institutions that were created in that period. And finally, his last life's work, which was dealing with the new world of global development, because Mr. Pearson was alive throughout the time that we went from being, and the UN went from being a group of 52 countries when it was first signed, to being now 193. And so the whole issue of what's the relationship between the rich and the poor, what's the relationship between developed and developing countries, how do we deal with the reality of decolonization? Yes, politically decolonization has happened. Yes, we're living in a post-colonial, post-imperial world, but not entirely. Imperial habits die very hard and slow. Imperial assumptions are still at the heart of the decision-making structures at the United Nations, at the World Bank itself, and at the International Monetary Fund. Which is why the creation of a genuinely post-colonial financial and development infrastructure for the world is so critically important. And the last thing that I want to say is that, on this score, is that it was for me a marker when Justin Trudeau came to the UN to give his first speech. And in that first speech, he talked about Indigenous issues, almost exclusively. And the people who were watching and listening at first said, what's he doing? He's revealing all of our dirty laundry in public. He's putting it all out on the clothesline. And somebody asked me, why do you think he did it? And I said, well, I talked to him about the speech before he gave it, and I think I know why he did it. It's because he wanted to demonstrate to the world that we are part of this world. The colonial experience is not something that is foreign or alien to us as Canadians. It is deeply embedded in who we are, which is why I've personally found the land acknowledgement and the comments of Her Honour this evening so meaningful. Because it's something we've learned to embrace as Canadians, and we've taken it in that direction. I just want to conclude by, this is when I even sort of let your belts out and relax. Okay, it's coming to an end, so we're almost there. So I can see the sun. I can see this. Lessons learned, just one comment. A few years ago, I had the opportunity to get a call from a French former politician. And, I don't think you should ever say you're a former politician. I think you have to say you're a recovering politician. Because the condition never really leaves you. The temptation is never entirely gone. Anyway, his name was Edgar Pisani. He was a member of the de Gaulle cabinet as a very young man, Minister of Agriculture. And he phoned me up out of the blue. I said, Mr. Pisani, and he said, you know who I am? I said, yes. He said, why? I said, well, when I was a kid, least the French network, you got to watch some political stuff. The Swiss was almost, it was so safe. There's nothing there. So I said, I know you are. He said, well, I'd like to meet you. I said, fine. So we struck up an enormous friendship, which carried on till the time of his passing. And when he died, we had a conference, not a funeral. We had a colloque. We had a discussion about what did he mean, and we had a whole talked about all of what he did and what he said and what he taught us. And at the end of it, we came up with a very simple, we called it the Pisani Protocol. What would Edgar say were his lessons? And these are Edgar's lessons, and I commend them to you. The first one, and Mr. Pearson would understand these as well. The first one is, it's more important to listen than it is to talk. Here I am, I've just finished talking for about 20 minutes. But it is so important. It is so important just to listen. When I was first elected to Parliament, I used to just go into the House of Commons and sit and listen. And it's pretty hard, actually. It's not easy to do, but I did it. And they said, why are you doing it? And I said, I just want to try to figure out where all these people are coming from. What are they really thinking? Like, is this? And I found that a valuable experience. And I can honestly say that particularly in working in the last 10, 15 years, quite intensely with Indigenous people across the country, I have found the lesson of learning how to listen. Just sit there. Don't say anything. Don't feel that you have to interrupt or listen. And most of us don't listen. If you watch people having a conversation, it's kind of interesting because sometimes people think listening is waiting to speak. So you're waiting for the other guy to shut up so you can just go in. And if he doesn't or she doesn't, then you have to interrupt them. No, not a good idea. Listen. The second thing he said, and this is the second Pisani lesson, is if you want to have a real conversation that leads to a resolution of a conflict, of a way of resolving a conflict, you have to start from the premise that you could be wrong and they could be right. So you almost in your own mind have to say when you're having a conversation, I could be wrong, but I don't recall watching Question Period or listening or being in Question Period, both in the legislature of Ontario and in the House of Commons and in the General Assembly, when anybody said, I could be wrong. I don't remember anybody ever saying that. But for those of us who are in partnerships of any kind, we know that it's not a bad idea to start out thinking, well, it's not going to go very well if you start out from the premise that I'm right and you're wrong. Maybe you got to start from the premise. Maybe the truth is somewhere, somewhere else. And we should figure out what it is. And the last point, and this is the one that really struck me as we were concluding that conversation in Paris. And that was that live your life in such a way that you are the person that makes the first two things happen. Create the space in your own life where that is what you do. Don't be known as the great talker. Be known as the great listener. Be known as the person who's waiting for the conversation to subside and try to figure out and ask questions. Be curious. Engage. Be kind. Don't assume the worst. Let that take root in how we conduct ourselves. And admitting that we can be wrong is the only thing that allows us to have a genuine conversation. We all watched a debate this week. Most of us did, I suspect. That's the opposite of everything that Pisani was telling us to do. Right? And it's kind of discouraging when you think about it. Here you have, the greatest democracy in the world about to elect a new president. And so I'm not saying this in derogatorily to the United States, not at all. Same thing's true for Canada. Same thing's true for ours of Scotland. Same thing's true of our own political debates. We are like two ships, I said ships, passing in the night. And we need to understand that that doesn't lead to a dialogue, and it doesn't lead to a resolution of a conflict. The inability to experience empathy, the inability to put ourselves in the shoes of people on the other side, even if we disagree with, dislike, and find intolerable what it is they're doing, the inability to at least put yourself in a position of saying, well, this is why they're saying what they're saying. Doesn't prevent us from having a disagreement. Doesn't mean we come away saying, I'm giving everything away to them because, they're right and I'm wrong. No, it doesn't mean that at all. It just means you start the premise that that's how you think you're going to be able eventually to resolve it. And one of the keys in mediation is you have to find the right moment. When is the moment when that can happen? Sometimes the moment doesn't come quickly. I happen to think, and looking at his record and looking at knowing him as I did as a person, had a wonderful sense of humor. He was the complete opposite of arrogant, complete opposite of self-important. He was the most engaging, open, honest kind of person you'd ever want to meet anywhere. He had a toughness at his core. You can't last as Prime Minister for more than 5 minutes if you don't have a toughness at your core. But he didn't let that get in the way of his ability to engage and to lead Canada into a world that is still the world we're in today, even though it's more complex and more difficult. All of you from all over the world who've come here, all of you students from all of the countries that I had an opportunity to meet some of you before, you may not have known Mr. Pearson, you may not have heard very much about him, you may not be totally familiar with him, but as Canadians, we're very proud of him. As Canadians, we're hugely proud that there is a wonderful school on the Pacific Ocean looking out into your future and into our future that has his name and that bears his legacy. We're very proud of it. I hope you are too. And even though you're only half as old as my school, that's okay. Seriously, we're all part of a great congregation, and it's wonderful to be able to spend time with you. And thank you very, very much for the opportunity to share some thoughts with you tonight. I really appreciate it. Thank you.